Now, do I have to do?
Oh, no, we're good. Hey, everyone. Hey, welcome to today's live recording of the Data Ideas podcast, joined by an esteemed member of the data community and friend of mine, Julius. Brian, good to see you again.
Great to be here. Great. I really appreciate the invite.
Yeah, absolutely. It's good to catch up and talk with you again. You've been busy. We last spoke, I think, at the last Data Career Summit where we had a hiring manager panel. I think it was like Impress the Hiring Manager was the panel
Yeah,
that you were on, and you've managed a lot of analysts over your career and hired many, and but you've been up to a lot since then. What have you been up to, and how are things going?
it's going great. Yeah, thanks for asking. As we were talking, I was saying I kind of feel like an extra in like the most interesting movie I've ever seen. Just with the way data is progressing and AI is moving so rapidly. I feel like the whole field, kind of changes on a weekly basis, and
Right.
so I've really been, kind of leaning into that, and really kind of following it closely, experimenting a lot with, the tools that are coming out, and kind of trying to get a real sense of how I think these tools are going to affect the way we do analysis in the future. And so it's been a lot of, it's been some client projects, it's been some personal projects, it's been talking with a lot of people in the community, kind of getting out experimenting. So that's really been the focus for about the past 2 years.
Cool. Awesome. And you've got this concept, data mad science. It's on the banner on your LinkedIn profile now, and there's a
Yeah.
community around this. Can you tell me more about that?
Yeah, it's funny. It kind of came out of a post I did a couple of years ago, and at the time, we were talking a lot about, kind of how do you get started in a career in data, and
Mm-hmm.
the thing you would hear all the time is, you've got to learn these tools and you've got to build a portfolio in this way, and I thought, what if you're just not inclined that way? And I'm
Mm-hmm.
not, I'm not
Mm-hmm.
somebody who, likes to do things necessarily in the, kind of the tried and true way. And so it was kind of this discussion I had with some folks, and Greg Deckler being one
Yeah.
of them, who
Mm-hmm.
kind of, if there's a standard way of doing things, you can be sure Greg is not going to be doing it that way. And
I do remember I was on the Data Viz contest review panel, I think, for Enterprise DNA with you and Greg. So I remember meeting him. Yeah.
right, I
Yeah.
remember
Yeah.
that.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so we were kind of talking, and a number of us really got in this discussion about, if you do have to kind of provide social proof of your abilities, but is there is
Mm-hmm.
there a different way than kind of taking the normal path? And we really came to the conclusion that there's a good way to do it if you're so inclined, which is this kind of mad scientist route, where instead of kind of presenting polished projects, what you're doing is you're out in public, kind of constantly experimenting, and
Mm-hmm.
trying new things and pushing the envelope. And some of those work and some of them don't. That's kind of the mad science part of it. Some of them kind of blow up in spectacular fashion, but some of them really work, and really advance the understanding of what the tools can do, and what some of the, in some sense, kind of off-label uses are. And so there's kind of a group, probably about a dozen of us, who are just constantly
Mm-hmm.
out there, kind of doing strange things with the tools that are available, and seeing how it works. And I think that's really been, for me, that's been incredibly motivating, and one of the best learning experiences I've ever had.
That's cool. That's awesome. That sounds like a ton of fun.
It
Can you
is.
give us an example, just maybe yeah, just like one thing that the group has produced or been working on, or even if it's just like conceptually what it is?
you know I mean, a lot of it these days is kind of centered around the intersection of AI and analysis and visualization. And so,
Mm-hmm.
one of the things we've really been talking about is kind of, with visualization, there's been this shift from, for the past 10 years, Tableau and Power BI have been really UI focused. It's click
Right.
and
Mm-hmm.
drag, um, kind of all focused on kind of making it, quote, simpler. But as you move to an AI dominated era, what's simpler for a computer and an AI is totally opposite of what's simpler for a human. And so AI does great at coding. It does really pretty poorly at clicking and dragging. I mean, you can replicate that to some extent, but it handles problems much better when it can just work in code. And I think you're seeing that in Claude Code and kind of the move to kind of terminal based and almost going back for me, like 30 plus years to DOS 3.1. It's fascinating how those commands and the look and feel of what I do these days is really much closer to what I was doing 30 years ago than what I was doing 2 years ago. And so a lot of us, we've been experimenting with, okay, in that kind of Claude Code terminal all code environment, how do you build visuals? How do you build dashboards? How do you kind of automate things like the IBCS structure and rule set, for data visualization? And so we've just kind of been out there, really just playing around and seeing are there ways in which we can speed things up in a pretty dramatic way. And I think we've shown there potentially is like a 10x efficiency improvement in this. And then kind of, are there other things you can do that you might not have been able to do even with the additional time in the past?
That's amazing, and looking forward to digging into this a little bit further here later in our discussion. Before I jump to kind of our next talking point, did just want to encourage, for those that are joining live, if you wouldn't mind just saying hello in the chat, let us know who you are, where you're coming from. It's always good to see who's joining live. And welcome to those that are listening to the recording. This podcast will be published out later today on all of our usual podcast platforms. So Brian, so for those, first of all, I should say, for those that might not know, I think most listeners probably know or have heard of Brian or are followers of you, but for those that don't know, Brian had a long career in analytics and was a analytics leader, and then got into the Power BI world and was a leader in that space, and worked for a training platform, Enterprise DNA, right, for Power BI, and has now kind of completely again reinvented himself as a data mad scientist, but also expert in MCP, and I think one of the leaders in content around MCP, which is something we definitely want to dig into. But what prompted this kind of latest shift from kind of, I would assume you're still a little bit focused on Power BI, but like the shift from that into focusing specifically more on MCP, like what prompted that, pun intended, for you?
A lot of it was my conversations with Sam Mackay. As these tools started coming out, we started playing around with them a lot, and really started seeing the potential for initially for data modeling, data cleaning, and then kind of further into analysis. And we just really again just started experimenting. And when MCP came out, and this was really not even a year ago, it was Anthropic that dropped that paper in November, the end of November of 2024. And it just, based on what we've been doing with testing large language models, it just made a tremendous amount of sense. And kind of having something that, instead of kind of keeping you locked within that chat box, that the ability of your AI to go out into the world and do things, to browse, to take screenshots, to access your local files, to write code and then execute it, and look at the results visually. Once you kind of give your AI the power to do some of those things, you just begin to see that the possibilities everywhere. And I think we really kind of did some initial testing, and there wasn't, when it first came out, there wasn't a lot of tools. And then there was this boom,
Yeah.
probably about February or March, where
Hmm.
thousands of tools just started proliferating, and there started
Totally.
to become this organization around it, where there are sites that are kind of aggregators and almost kind of fill the role that CRAN does for R. So for those who are R fans, CRAN is kind of this huge public repository where they actually kind of impose a documentation standard and an update standard, and so you can be pretty certain that when you pull up a package from CRAN, that's been reviewed, that's up to date, it's got full documentation. And so I think what we're starting to see is people on the MCP side kind of building that sort of governance and kind of quality control. And as that's happened, we've just continued to kind of expand our experiments. And what we found is that we've always kind of talked about an analytics stack in terms of SQL, R or Python, Excel, Power BI or Tableau. And
Hmm.
what we found with MCP is it gets down to a granularity where everybody can individually have their own stack, that's specifically matched to exactly the type of work you do, the types of analyses you perform, the types of visualizations you create. And
Hmm.
it kind of opens up this whole world where all you're doing is you're talking to the AI. The AI is
Hmm.
calling the tools that kind of fit your stack, and it's a completely different experience.
That's really interesting, and it's actually it's I want to share this with you. Before we went live, I was jotting down, there was a project that, so I've been following Brian's content at MCP, and as a longtime practitioner, when he first started posting and writing about it, and then I was interested in what he was writing, and I went and listened and watched some videos on my own, and I was like, okay, yeah, this seems pretty transformational. And I was just jotting down on a piece of paper in front of me. I was thinking of where this could have been useful in my prior life and trying to tie it to a practical example. I had a project as an example once where we had this hypothesis, which started out in just an office discussion where we thought, a product or some products that we had were economy driven for the most part, and there's all these economic indicators out there. And we were curious, how did our sales of this product or basket of products correlate with the movement in economic indicators? And I figured you would appreciate this example as an economist as well, right? But then we thought, well, guess what? There's consensus forecasts for where these indicators are going, and if we could figure out, which indicators our product sales are tied to, we could then use the consensus forecast for those economic indicators to potentially forecast our product sales, right? And it turns out that our hypothesis was true. There were some economic indicators that were really, really good indicators for where this product would go. Of course, we were reliant on the accuracy of the forecast for the indicators, in terms of the ability to project the product sales. But as I think about what I had to do, so I could have just written up that idea and a prompt to go, do all the steps that it would take to get from analyzing the economic data, comparing it with our product data, bringing a data source together with those, doing some analysis, figuring out which indicators were correlated, building a predictive model based off of it, and then visualizing where our product sales were going, right, based upon the analyst consensus forecast for those indicators. All of those steps, it feels to me like MCP could potentially, if I'm understanding it right, and Brian, by the way, everyone has 1,000 times the expertise on me than this, so that's why I'm asking him. But could I, practically speaking, put together a prompt in the right way, in such a way where we could connect the LLM that I was prompting to go and connect to all of the different tools to scrape that data, put it into a data source, do the analysis, and then publish a visualization, essentially? Am I thinking about this the right way, Brian? Okay.
That is exactly the workflow. And the thing about MCP is, if you think about the traditional way you would have had to do it, you would have had to go in your browser, search for the data, maybe scrape the data, bring it back into, Power Query, clean the data. Then you've got to model it, and you've got to basically be moving, you know, moving data in and out of all sorts of things that, you know,
Mm-hmm.
you've got it from the browser, you download it, you know, it goes, maybe you look at it in Excel, then you put it into Power Query, then it goes in,
Exactly.
you export from Power Query into CSV
Yep.
to pull into
Yep.
R or Python to do the
Mm-hmm.
statistics, and then, you know, back out somewhere to do the visualization.
100%.
MCP just takes care of all that. Like it makes it almost seamless in the sense that I spend 80% of my day at least within one MCP client. Yeah.
Mm.
And this whole thing about jumping back and forth between apps and all, it's not even relevant in the way that kind of analysis under this framework works. That even the idea of apps isn't even a thing.
Mm-hmm.
That you almost, in a sense, you almost change your whole operating system. Your operating system becomes the MCP client. And
Mm-hmm.
so what you're doing is you're just sitting in that client, kind of calling tools from your AI. And the really interesting thing about this is, you know, people express that you know, their biggest concern almost always about AI is the dependability of what the LM can produce. And you know, it's definitely gotten better. You know, the models are getting better and better, but there's always a random element to it. Even if you crank the
Right.
temperature all the way down to zero, what people who are experts in this have explained to me is that you're still going to have some element of randomness, because
Mm-hmm.
what cranking the temperature to zero says is you're always bound to the next most probable token. But what happens in a lot of cases, you get a tie. And to break that tie, there's still some element of randomness. And
Right.
so you're probably never going to get an LLM to completely eliminate, you know, to make it completely deterministic where two people running the same query in the same way are going to get exactly the same answer. You know, that's, I think, unlikely. And so what you want to do is, instead of kind of putting the burden on your AI, the analogy I like to use is you want to take Einstein and turn him into the world's smartest receptionist.
Gotcha.
And,
Mm-hmm.
you know, that basically, instead of having your AI doing the analysis, what you want it to do is to say, okay, all it needs to do is it needs to call the right tool to do the part of that analysis that's next. And so, you know, it may be that you've got a, you know, web scraper tool, and you have the AI calls the web scraper tool with the parameters saying, okay, I want you to scrape these data for this year range and across this geography. And it kind of pushes the parameters into that tool, and then the tool runs validated, you know, kind of proven code. And so you're eliminating, to a large extent, that random element. And you know, what we found is that AI can call tools really quickly and accurately. You know, a
Mm-hmm.
top-notch frontier model like, you know, Gemini Pro or Sonnet, you know, Sonnet 4 or Opus 4.1 are great tool callers. And so you can really much more dependably do analyses once you've got it kind of routing out to the proper tools, than if you kind of burden the AI to do the whole thing itself.
And taking a quick step back, we talked about an example a few minutes ago, but what, in your own words, how would you explain MCP to someone that maybe is listening that hasn't even heard about it, or maybe they heard about it but hasn't done any investigating on their own? How would you describe it, just kind of in simple terms, on your own?
Yeah, you know what I would say. I mean, the analogy that gets used a lot is it's kind of USB-C for AI tools. That it's this common set of connectors, and the way it used to work is, if you tried to link a tool to an AI model, you had to do it through the API, and every API, you know, was different, and you know, you had to write all the code around that, and it was and then getting them all to interact properly was a nightmare. And so what Anthropic did was they kind of set this standard where as long as you're adhering to the MCP protocol, you can just take and plug those tools in almost kind of a, plug and play. I mean, it's not quite plug and play yet, but it's getting really, really close. Where you can just take it, in some cases, just double click on an MCP package, and it'll install into your client and link to your AI model. And now you've got, in some sense, like, a given MCP server might have 25 tools in it. So, one of the things I use is Supabase, which is a Postgres database that is very smartly MCP enabled. And so when I'm hooked up to my MCP client, I can then access that database. I can execute SQL commands. I can manipulate that data. I can pull all the metadata down. I can create other tables. I can create relationships. And the thing about it is that, again, it's got this, this list of 29 tools. And if I want to swap that out, if I want to say, okay, like it doesn't do X, I can then say, okay, find me, I can even ask the AI, find me a tool that does this. And it'll go out and search and say, okay, I've come back with, 3 tools that do that. And then I can say, okay, go ahead and install that tool for me. And it'll actually, if you give it access to the local file system, it'll actually write the configuration into your config file, set the thing up, and then you can even get it to say, write me a 2-page cheat sheet with all your best tips on the 10 best ways to use that. And I can show you, what I do is I have it give me that, and then I laminate it. And so, I've got the AI basically teaching me to use the MCP tools.
It's amazing. In terms of tools, what, maybe we can talk about some of the popular analytics tools and platforms that folks may be more familiar with, what's out there that's compatible with MCP today. And then also curious, like if you've prompted, put a prompt together where you've asked for recommendations on tools to connect to, like, are there any surprises in terms of the tools that are out there that, maybe you hadn't heard of them and they did something really cool, or like, so what's out there that's like popular tools that you can connect to? And then what are some that are kind of more interesting to you? Yeah.
So the really popular ones are things like some of the official ones, like GitHub is a great one. You can have it manage basically your whole version control. Creating repos, branching, merging, writing the readmes, pushing documentation, kind of all of that, just natural language. And what I do is I just use voice. I use a program called Whisper Flow, which is the best voice to text program I've ever used. And I've been using those programs for about 10 years. And so all I'm doing basically is talking to it, and what, so the GitHub one, the one that I recommend people start with is if you've got a personal knowledge management application. So if you say Notion or Obsidian, that is a phenomenal way to basically increase your knowledge and also the AI's knowledge. So I've got a 6 gigabyte Obsidian vault of every piece of content I've ever written.
Oh, really?
Yeah. All the content I've saved from other people, Medium articles, LinkedIn posts, anything that I think this is information I want to be able to search and retrieve for the future. So I've got 6 gigabytes of that. And now my AI is trained on all that, and it has immediate access through MCP. So I can say, okay, like for I was working on a project the other day, analyzing airport data, for Washington National
Yep, I
Airport.
saw that analysis that you published. Yeah.
And so
Yeah.
what I did was basically I said I had stored a lot of documents for that in Obsidian, and when I started up the project again the next day, I just said to my AI, go to my Obsidian vault, look in the airport project, and review the files.
Mhm.
And it does that. It says, okay, like I understand what we're doing. I've got all these things now lined up in my memory. What do you want to do next?
Yeah.
And it's really kind of an incredible way. And the other thing it'll do is it'll learn, and if you give it the instructions in your custom instructions, what it'll do is you can say, if you come to a point in an analysis or responding to a query where you feel like you don't have enough information, go to this part of my Obsidian vault and look for that information before you do anything else. And so
Got it.
what you'll see when you kind of watch the conversation is it'll kind of come to a point where it's stumped, and they'll say, oh, okay, let me check the vault. And it goes in, it's got 6 gigs of information now that it can
That's amazing.
it can pull. So what I feel is you've kind of got your prompting knowledge and your context knowledge augmented by everything you've ever done in the past. And the power that creates is remarkable.
That's amazing. That's interesting. Now I'm wondering, I wonder if we took the, I have the Friday jobs rundown post. I wonder, maybe we could put all those posts into Obsidian Vault, and maybe we could do some analysis on who the movers and shakers are in terms of doing hiring, what trends we see in titles, things like that. That might be an interesting one. Maybe I should start saving those.
Definitely. I mean, that's a perfect example, is that what you can even do with that is you can say, okay, read through the structure. If the posts are of similar structure every week, build that into a CSV or a Parquet data set that I can use, and then you can say, okay, upload that to my my database. For my case, it would be Supabase. It can be Fabric. It can be whatever you use. And then the really interesting thing I found is that there's kind of a great merge of kind of old school, new school here, which is the way I was taught to do analysis was you always start with an analysis plan. And your analysis plan is, what are the questions you're asking?
Right.
What's the data you have? What's the data you need? What are the hypotheses you have with regard to those questions? What are the tests you're going to run? What are the visualizations you're going to do? And what I found is, that all through my career, and for most of it, I was working for the government, where the work I was doing, it was actually a legal requirement to publish your plan.
Yeah.
And so, it really reinforced this idea of, analysis plan first. And what I've found is, in the MCP and AI context, that kind of old school plan is golden, because it's basically what it is. It's a giant prompt.
Sure.
And it's a giant prompt that gives the AI vision into your whole analysis. And so what you can do with that is you can say, okay, here's this huge flat file that I just had to create of, all the jobs data. And here are the questions I want to ask about that jobs data. Now come back to me with recommendations for the schema that I should build to support that.
Yeah, totally.
And it'll come back with a detailed plan. And then you can say, okay, I like that, build that schema. And you'll just watch it, kind of magically rearrange all your data, and do what could be hours or even days of data modeling and of edge function creation and testing, all just happen right in front of you. It's remarkable the first time you see it.
That's amazing, and it sounds really transformative. And I think I mentioned this in one of my posts this week, but my mind has been going wild with use cases for this. And now that we're talking and having this conversation, it's going even wilder. I think it's a good prelude to the next question. And I think there's no question that this is going to have a significant impact on the scope of, analytics professionals' roles.
I think so.
I'm curious your thoughts on what that may look like, in the nearer term, maybe next 6 to 12 months. And then we can talk about longer term, but maybe we start with the short term. What are you thinking?
Yeah, it's funny because I think the kind of the more limited view of what data analysis was, which is, kind of the creation of reports, I think is going to be kind of a commodity. If it's not already. I mean, one of the things that I've been experimenting a lot with is this program called Plotly Studio. And Plotly Studio basically will take that analysis plan or, a large prompt or even a small prompt and basically just turn it into a whole series of visuals, and if you give it specificity, as you were saying, kind of that analysis, the economic analysis that you were talking about, it can do the correlation matrices, it can do the heat maps, it can do the the time series forecasts, all kind of automatically, and the visuals it creates are really pretty spectacular, and they're interactive. So it's putting slicers, it's putting filters, it's putting all sorts of interactive features in there. And I think when you look at what AI is capable of, the kind of what I call the wrench turning aspect of data analysis, the coding, the visualization, the kind of creation of those things, I think is really going to become less important. That in some sense, I think we're very close to the point where AI can do most of that better than almost all of us anyway. And so, really, I think what it does is it puts us in a management role. What I like to tell people is, whether you wanted it or not, you've all been promoted to managers, and that you're now managing these teams of AI. And it's remarkable to me, as somebody who's spent a lot of time both doing analysis in my career and managing teams of analysts, how similar managing teams of AI is to managing teams of people in a lot of ways. The parallels are really astonishing, and particularly when I'm interacting by voice, it is very hard to tell, I think, to somebody, my wife upstairs, listening, whether I'm on a call with a person or whether I am just, prompting and talking to my AI. If you don't hear the other side of the conversation, it's very hard to tell, because it just sounds like, to a large extent, it sounds like the conversation we're having.
Right. Interesting. Do you think that, and so, for the last decade or so, building a new data product from scratch, going through all the steps and all phases to do that and release it, and get engagement and such, this is something that has been, for the most part, managed by technical folks. Do you think that this is going to change things? Do you think non-technical folks are going to be able to step in and start producing data products? Or, what's your take on that? How long is that going to take?
Yeah, that's a great question.
Yeah.
I kind of think in some respects, the idea of data products is going to change, because I think one of the things I think that's been a downside of the dashboard era is, I like to think of it, is that when it came about, I think a lot of us, myself included, were like, wow, this is awesome. And this is now, this is the hammer that we're going to hit everything with. And, you talk to people, and I did a lot of this myself, is that every request that came to you became a dashboard.
Right.
And, I've talked to people who, there was one conversation I had on a post where, I said, I talked to somebody who had 300 dashboards, and
Yeah.
people came back to me and said 300 is nothing. We've got 1,200 or we've got
Sure.
3,000. And when you think about that, it's like how much wasted time and effort and resources goes into 1,200 dashboards, of which probably 10 of them get used regularly.
Totally. Yeah.
And so I think that when you now have the ability to really just query your data live with natural language, it potentially, I think, really brings the idea of self-service BI to the forefront in a way I think it's never been. I think we thought it was going to be with with the dashboards, but really hasn't been to a large extent. And so I think I don't think dashboards are going to go away, but I think what you're going to see is they become really focused on those things that are recurrent, widespread, and need that single source of truth for everybody. And
Sure.
a lot of analyses are not that way. They're not persistent. They're a one-time question or a periodic question. And for your point about which time series are correlated with the variables we care about.
Right. Yep.
That's an in-depth question. It's a difficult question, but once you resolve it, you don't need to keep going back to it, every week or every month.
Right.
Maybe you need to see, okay, over the years, do those patterns remain stable?
Exactly. Yep.
And so, I think with the speed and the customization with which you can do those sorts of non-recurrent analyses, what I found is it really changed. Even if you go into analysis with a really well-refined plan, what happens is you get surprised by things and you say, oh, that did not produce the result I thought it was going to. And okay, that now raises a whole bunch of other questions. And the ability to kind of dig in with potentially some very complicated methodologies very quickly, in response to something you may not have anticipated, is a whole new experience for me. Because normally it would be like, okay, that isn't what I expected. Let me go back and write 2 days worth of code to reroute that analysis to something else, or to dig further into why that's happening. And
sure,
the ability to kind of do that. I mean, Art Tenick is one of my, kind of my favorite mad scientists. And he did something the other day where in 5 minutes, he had AI create a machine learning response to a question he had. And, the ability to do that, and then to look at that data and, analyze it in almost the same way you would do it, an exploratory data analysis, kind of simple things of means and medians. The fact that you can now do, machine learning or, principal components analysis, with a voice prompt, it just kind of opens the door for levels of analysis we've never been able to do.
That's pretty exciting. And I did want to just give a shout out. There's a few folks. And if you are joining live, let us know, say hello, let us know where you're joining from. Just want to say hi to Taki Manthan, and then also Albert.
Hey, Albert.
Yeah. He was just on the podcast a few weeks ago, but he said he never thought he'd see the day of seeing you live.
Yeah, I mean, I want to give a huge shout out to to him, because his LinkedIn hard mode really taught me how to develop content. 4 years ago, I didn't even have a LinkedIn account, and I came on, and he was really the one who taught me. When I first started, I was posting 3 times a day. I was stepping all over my own content. I was kind of gearing to the wrong audience, and he really provided the structure and the discipline and the community to help me understand how you interact in this environment. So I have this huge debt to Albert, and really recommend that anybody who's struggling with kind of building a profile and an online kind of proof of skills, really talk to him, because he is one of the best there is. And I really, really thank him for, kind of helping me reach an audience that I never would have expected to be able to do.
Mm-hmm. Yep, absolutely agree with that. And Albert has some really good advice, to Brian's point, for professionals, whether you're early career stage to mid or late career stage, just on how to promote yourself, market yourself, and even like push yourself outside of your comfort zone, to do things that maybe not everyone would do to get yourself in front of, whether it's hiring managers or just other interesting professionals in the field, where you can benefit from learning from them or having some connection with them. Albert is just really, really good at teaching those skills and tactics for building your network and getting your foot in the door in places and pushing beyond your comfort level. So appreciate you joining, Albert. If anyone does have any questions, drop them in the chat. Maybe we could take one or two. But one thing I wanted to ask you about, Brian, it feels to me kind of, I've mentioned this to folks, it feels to me kind of like 2015 or 2016, where I saw some of the data viz tools that were coming out and they were out, but I was starting to really think about how I could use them to produce things for the organizations I was working for that had never been done before. And I just had all these ideas of use cases, and I could just see that in the next few years, like, this is going to be a big deal, like this is really going to change things and proliferate. And it was kind of like that calm before the storm at that point. And I've told folks, it really feels like that point right now again. It feels like the calm before the storm. Things are really going to change. Technology, like what we're talking about today, is going to proliferate. What are some of and it's interesting because I've talked with other peers and professionals, and I think a lot of folks have maybe I shouldn't say a lot, but some have heard about MCP, if you know about it, but no one's really deep in it, and certainly at the organizational level, I think a lot of organizations are not thinking about it, or certainly
Right.
have a roadmap for how it would be used. I think for people listening, that have technical and business acumen, they can connect the dots in terms of what some of the use cases or opportunities could be. But what would you be thinking about if you were a leader of an organization? What are some of the opportunities that this might open up, just at a high level?
I mean, it's almost too big a question, in the sense that
it's a big one.
that, and it's really, I think, one of the things I like about, being in this community and, kind of posting content is you get challenged a lot, and, it's almost always respectful and, smart challenges. And one of the things that, I think people have been responding to in my content is that they're saying, okay, this is cool. And, it's really, you've kind of shown that this is possible, but is it feasible at an organizational and enterprise level?
Right.
And, the kind of, you and Sam and Greg and, some of these other folks have become kind of, efficient one-man armies, but is that extensible? And, I think it's a great question. I think it's a very fair critique. And, with regard to MCP, it's a little bit of the Wild West right now, but it's interesting because I think it really parallels what we saw with LLMs initially. It was when people started, grabbing on a ChatGPT and using it. Everybody was saying, oh, this isn't secure. You're potentially going to be breaching, organizational information. And that did happen. I mean, I'm not gonna sugarcoat that. It did happen. It happened with the web, it happened with email. I think every major shift in technology, comes with that rocky transition point. But I think what we're seeing is, that pretty quickly after, LLMs kind of hit the scene, that you started getting, the team versions and the enterprise versions and the versions where it didn't train on your data, and, you could keep things, locked down. I think that's really been one of the things Microsoft's pushed with Copilot is, it's kind of integrated already into the enterprise system that you've got. And so I kind of see the same thing with MCP, that, people who are saying, oh, it's cool and you can do all kinds of neat stuff with it, but it's not really ready for prime time in the enterprise. And
Sure.
I think that's a valid point, but I think it's getting there very quickly. And
Got
I
it.
think
Mhm.
when you see the efficiency gain and the way in which it kind of extends the ability of every analyst, that
Mhm.
I can't see how business is not going to embrace that and figure out a way to basically get it within the kind of the acceptable bounds of privacy, security, kind of organizational control to some extent. And I think again, you're already seeing that because in the platforms like like Anthropic, OpenAI, they've now got these kind of very well defined and kind of strictly limited on ramps to certain MCP tools, and so
Mhm.
they're often called connectors. And so the
Mhm.
ability to connect to your email, to your Slack, to your GitHub, those are becoming easier and easier, and those are really becoming part of the enterprise tools. And so I think what's going to happen is you're going to see this kind of slow and steady progression. Some of the stuff I'm doing is definitely kind of out at the edge, but I think what you're seeing is each iteration of the new models coming out. And I think you look
Mhm.
at GPT-5, if you go into some of the setup for GPT-5, it has
Mhm.
pretty extensive MCP tools built right in. And
Mhm.
so I think what people are looking at now, saying this is kind of cool and kind of one-man army stuff, is very quickly going to become corporatized and more tightly
Mhm.
controlled and safer. And I just I think a year from now, or maybe much less, it's going to be something that every analyst is using to some extent.
And I appreciate you being on the edge with this, because you're being on the edge and writing about it makes a lot of us better and more informed. It certainly makes me better. This is certainly something that's come to the forefront of what I'm interested in much more quickly than it would have been had you not been out there leading and writing about it. So definitely want to thank you on behalf of the community for all that you do to keep us on the edge along with you. You
Thanks. Yeah,
mentioned that
and
it,
one
yeah,
of the really satisfying things is when I hear people say, "Hey, I tried this out and it
yeah,
really worked," and
yeah,
now I'm doing stuff
yeah.
I kind of can't believe I'm doing, and that's a win every day. I hear that.
That's awesome. And so let Brian know as you're experiencing those wins. He likes to hear that. So shoot him a note and let him know. Yeah.
I mean, even better, the thing I would
Cool.
encourage people is
Yeah.
post
Yeah.
your wins, even if they're
Cool.
not total wins, even if they've still got,
Mhm.
some rough edges, post them, show them in public, because, to the extent that, it's data you can share, because I think that makes us all better.
Totally. Absolutely agree. Very cool. Yes. Definitely post what you're doing, and then others can learn from you too and be inspired just in the way that Brian's inspiring others. So there's a cumulative effect to that. So I love that recommendation. One final question as we wrap things down, Brian, you mentioned that this is going to extend the ability of every analyst, if and maybe within the next 12 months or so time frame, certainly sooner rather than later. If
Yeah.
you were a data practitioner today, um, what would your advice be to them in terms of what they should be thinking about being prepared to make sure that they can be well positioned to lever this technology and maintain a solid value proposition for themselves as a practitioner within their organization in light of this? What's your thoughts?
This time I have really strong feelings about, and
Hmm.
it's really not based so much on the tools. It really is going back to building your fundamentals. And what I see, and some of the frustration I have, is much of the analysis I see is just descriptive.
Hmm.
It's just kind of what happened in the past. That here's the history of the line graph. Here are some KPI cards that show maybe year over year. And
Hmm.
it, I look at a lot of this and I say, okay, like, who cares?
Right.
What is this
Hmm.
answering? And knowing what happened in the past is only the first step. And so, the fact that we've now, as analysts, all have these incredibly powerful tools that can get us from not just the descriptive, but the diagnostic, saying, okay, why did this happen, to the predictive, which is what's going to happen next, to the prescriptive, which is, okay, what should we do about all this, given that we now know, kind of past, present, future. And I think a lot of it is really kind of going back to building that foundation, of statistics, of, methods, of, research. There's a book I recommend everybody called The Art of Statistics. And I kind of feel like when you become a data analyst, like, you should get a copy of that book handed to you. And the guy who wrote it was actually knighted, believe it or not.
Oh, really?
And, yeah. Yeah. And it's the single best book I've ever read in terms of figuring out the questions to ask and planning your analysis and kind of developing that mindset of, kind of the 5 whys, of continually asking, why did this happen? Okay, given that we know why it might have happened, what are the things that are, as you said, the other things that are correlated there, that we can use, knowing that knowledge, and kind of the continual digging down of understanding the dynamics that that led to that result. And so I think it's a combination of really strengthening your methods foundation and really strengthening your domain knowledge, because I think that the thing that AI does not do well is kind of the big vision and the domain knowledge, that the wrench turning and kind of saying, okay, once you've got those questions well defined and how you want to examine them, AI is a demon at actually doing that, that legwork. And so, kind of using the time you gain in efficiency to kind of build your domain knowledge and build your methodological foundation for analysis, I kind of feel like those people are going to be absolute winners in this.
Love it. I love the advice. Brian, this has been awesome. I appreciate you sharing a wealth of expertise with the community, as you always do, packed into this hour for this podcast recording. But I did want to ask in closing, how can folks, I know you're super active on LinkedIn, but don't know if there's if you have any other, blogs or anything. Is there anything, how can folks follow more of your content?
Yeah, I get that question, and I started a YouTube channel. I got to admit, I don't really like doing it that much, because it just doesn't feel interactive to me, and so I need to get a little better at putting my stuff up there. I've also been thinking about doing some Medium articles, in terms of longer form pieces, but right now it's really just the LinkedIn, feed, and the Data Mad Science YouTube channel.
Cool. Well, we'll be sure to put links to both of those in the show notes. If you're listening, you can find those links under the show when you're done listening. But I would recommend, if you're not following Brian already on LinkedIn, I know many people probably already are, but if you're not, one of the top people in the data world to follow. I've learned a ton from you, Brian, myself. I know so many others are very appreciative of everything that you put out there. To use your words earlier, you really are on the leading edge of things, and you're making us all better. So I definitely appreciate that, and I appreciate you joining for an hour today.
Thanks so much. I really appreciate those kind words, and I'm just very thankful to be part of this community. It really is a great community, and there's just some phenomenally smart, creative people out there. And I kind of feel like if we all kind of contribute a little, and kind of advance things a little bit, forward together, we do some amazing stuff. And, that I'm just so thankful for the people whose work, I've built on, and, just welcome, feedback. And as I say, kind of people who've been inspired just, to check into this, start putting your stuff out there, don't be afraid, because it's not going to be perfect. Nothing I've put out there is. Some of it has been, pretty shaky. But in kind of going through that process, it really does refine things, and it really, the dialogue and the experimentation just, really advance things for all of us. So, I want to thank those people who've been really active in that discussion, and really, kind of it's kind of, standing on the shoulders of giants.
Love it. Totally agree. Wonderful closing remarks. Thanks so much, Brian, again for joining. And I think I'll see you next. I think I'll see you next month.
Yeah, I look forward to
talking about that. Yeah, for sure. That's another benefit. To Brian's point, if you put yourself out there, you meet new people. Next month, I think I'm gonna get to have a chance to have dinner with the legend here. So I'll be out in the DC.
Can't wait.
Yeah,
it's on me.
Sounds good. Cool. All right. All right. Thanks again, Brian. And
Thanks so
we'll
much.
talk with you soon. Yeah. Bye-bye.